Ladies and gentlemen, it's the 1957 USSR Championship held in Moscow. We have Mikhail Tal against Tigran Petrosian. Just a fun fact, Tal went on to win this tournament against other chess legends like Boris Spassky, Mark Taimanov, and many more. Tal opens with e4, Tigran plays e6, the French defense. Tal with d4, controlling the center, d5 as expected, the follow-up in the French and creating some tension in the center. Tal develops knight to c3, adding a defender to the e4 square. Tigran develops bishop to b4, pinning the knight to the king. And here Tal pushes e5. And just a side note, the e5 pawn in these advanced French type positions is a very important pawn. So now we get c5, trying to chip away at white center. And with a3, Tal asks the bishop what it wants to do. We get takes and takes. And Tigran develops the knight and preparing to castle. We get queen to g4, knight to f5, defending the pawn and also centralizing the knight. Now Tal develops a light squared bishop, hitting the knight, the defender of the g2 square. Tigran attacks the queen with h5. Queen retreats to h3 and we get takes, and not recapturing, but developing the knight instead. Tigran also develops his knight to c6. And if you wonder, there was also the option to take the pawn on c6. So yeah, if you take. But in this position, black basically just lose their advantage and they're not well developed. So going back, the knight was developed. Tal goes all out with g4, hitting the knight. Note the pawn is pinned to the rook, so it cannot recapture. We get knight f to e7, retreating the knight. We get takes, and queen to c7. Now two attackers and only one defender on the e5 pawn. Note the engine wanted queen to a5 in this position. Tal develops his bishop and adds a defender. And Tigran now adds an attacker with knight to g6. Now there's 3 versus 2. And also note the bishop is undefended. We get queen to g4, getting out of the pin and now threatening to take the knight. And also defending the bishop. We get takes and takes and takes, and queen to g5, hitting the pawn. Tigran now proposes a queen trade, but Tal declines and takes the pawn. Tigran again proposing a queen trade to get rid of the queen. Here the engine wanted Tigran to take the h-pawn instead. So Tal rejects again and goes back to defending the pawn. And yet another attempt to trade the queens and get it off the board. Tal accepts this time, but on his own terms. In other words, improving his pieces while doing it. So we got rook to g1 and get takes and takes, still keeping an eye on the pawn. Tigran develops his bishop. It is worth noting in the French that the white bishop is quite a bad bishop, as his pawns are all on light squares. And Tal improves his king, which turns out to be a blunder actually. Engine wanted h5. So if black takes it with the rook, he's in trouble. So for instance, if we got h5 and then simply in trouble. King e2 was played. Tigran also improves his king. King e3, rook to f8, preparing to push the pawn. Tal doubles up on the g file. And we get bishop to e8 indirectly with two attackers on h5. Knight to f5, and here Tal trying to improve his king. If Tigran takes the knight, so we rather get a blunder with f5. And we got the best move from Tal, taking with check. And we get takes, and Tal improving his king while also supporting his pawn. We get f4, and Tal gives a check. Tigran blocks with his rook. Tal proposes a rook trade, trying to remove an attacker on his h-pawn as well. So we get takes and takes. Tigran now proposing a rook trade with the rook to f8. Tal accepts, as it causes black's king to be less active on the king side of the board. King takes on f8, and we got h6. Here the engine wanted king to c5, activating the king even further. I guess what Tal wanted to do was to align his pawn and his bishop to work together. Anyway, we got b6. Basically, the entry squares are cut off from the king. Note we are in the endgame, so it's important to restrict your opponent's pieces. Tal takes the pawn and now up 5 pawns to 6. King to g8, trying to cover the promotion square. And bishop to g6, and I think this is a brilliant move, which we'll see just now. Something I never thought of. Anyway, we get a5 from Tigran, expanding on the queen side and taking away squares from the king. King to d4 was played, but the engine rather wanted h7 check. Anyways, the black king is quite restricted to the back rank in this case. King to f8, c3, just improving and keeping an eye on the b4 square. King to g8, Tigran just passing time, and now we get h7 check. King g7, attacking the bishop, but he can't actually take it because then the pawn would promote. And this is the reason why I thought the previous bishop move was so clever, because now he's able to propose a pawn trade, keeping in mind the king is tied down to his h-pawn. Tigran rejects the trade and defends the pawn, and now we get bishop to g8, completely taking the black king out of the game. Bishop to c8, king d3, bishop back to d7, king on its way to gobble up the pawns. King to h8, totally out of the game, and at this stage the bar is plus 7.2 for white. King d3, b5, and it's here, ladies and gentlemen, where the magician start making things disappear. So the king takes, Tigran sacks a pawn to create a pass pawn on the queen side. This is a very important concept overall, although in this case it wasn't well executed. So we get takes and b4 creating a passed pawn. We get takes and Tigran pushes a4. Tal pushes d5, a3, just 2 squares away from promoting, sacrificing more material. Tal takes the pawn on e6, a2 from Tigran, almost promoting. Tal collects the bishop as well. Finally Tigran promotes, but it's too late. Tal also promotes, and we see the magic on the board. Tal is up 8 points in material and plus 11.8 on the bar. We get check, king moves, another check, king runs, another check, and this is mate in 12 actually. And we got king to d7, and ladies and gentlemen, Tigran resigned in this position as he's completely lost, and without much commentary, the game would have continued as follows. Just exchanging the queens and making more queens, mate in 3, mate in 2, mate in 1, and mate. Thank you for watching and helping me out to reach my goal of 1,000 subs.